Let's look at this article on the Paris Agreement. It's by Kathleen Livingstone, April 23rd, 2021, from Inside Climate News. And it says, the Paris Agreement was a first step, not an end goal. Still, the world's nations are far behind. Most have yet to even establish detailed plans for meeting their targeted greenhouse gas emissions, making Biden's goal simple: preventing catastrophe. Without any further intervention, the world is on track to raise global average temperature by around 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, falling dangerously short of the goals laid out in the Paris Agreement, according to the UN's 2020 Emissions Gap Report. A pillar of the landmark treaty was signatory countries promised to work toward limiting global temperature increase to no more than 2 degrees Celsius, but ideally to 1.5 degrees, in order to avoid the most catastrophic effects of climate change, including scorching heat waves, devastating droughts, and the displacement of millions of climate refugees. Goal number one of our climate policy is preventing catastrophe, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on Monday in leading up to the two-day virtual leaders summit on climate. So it says, although many participants in Biden's summit have pledged to achieve ambitious reductions in the next decade, the treaty includes no real consequences for failing to reach those goals, and many climate experts question whether meeting even the least ambitious goals set forth in the Paris Climate Agreement will be enough to stem the worst effects of global warming. So, all of this is they've got about a fourth of it right, and no more than a fourth of it. And if you've got 3/4 of it wrong, then you're not going to be going in the right direction. So, one thing that they're getting wrong is to think that climate is all about carbon dioxide. It's all about atmospheric carbon. And we're not going to look at other things that affect climate like water. I mean, water is a major misunderstood and mismanaged resource, both in the problem of climate change and solutions to climate change. So we could be managing our water in such a way as to create healthy microclimates. Because water has a cooling effect, especially when you have lots of vegetation like trees and forests, and if you have agricultural ground that is covered instead of agricultural ground that is bare dirt. So that bare dirt is like a hot plate, so it creates a lot of hot air. Whereas if you had at least grasses, cover crops on that agricultural land, then it wouldn't be a hot plate, and it could be a place where water would soak into the ground. So we need to be managing our water correctly, so as to contribute the water back to the water cycle. And if we do that, we'll be creating microclimates one at a time, and that eventually creates a really good climate. I didn't expect to spend so much time talking about water, but it's one of those things where we need to look at the climate in a way that is holistic. We need to be looking not just at climate narrowly, we need to be looking at desertification. We need to reverse the process of desertification all over the world, not just in Africa, not just in Asia, but in the United States as well. We are in the process of desertifying in the way we manage our urban areas. We could be managing our rainwater, our stormwater, so that it would soak into the ground and be good for vegetation. And we could be managing our rainwater and our vegetation in a way as to create healthy, living soils that absorb carbon. So all this is a holistic approach. Instead, what we have is a narrow approach where we're taught to think that climate is all about atmospheric carbon, and if we reduce our atmospheric carbon, then we'll be good to go. Meanwhile, we have major problems like desertification, major problems like the loss of biological diversity, which includes deforestation, and and we have justice and we have war. So food, water, and war are three things that, if the Paris Climate Agreement does not address those things, and does not make all three of those things a major part of our climate solution, then it's going to be a big distraction. And it is a big distraction. So anyway, let me continue reading. A pillar of the landmark treaty was signatory countries' promise to work toward limiting global temperature increase to no more than 2 degrees Celsius. So in order to avoid the most catastrophic effects of climate change, including scorching heat waves, devastating droughts, and the displacement of millions of climate refugees. So we don't want to displace millions of climate refugees, but how many climate refugees do we have because of war? Like the war in Syria, which the U.S. is just, the war in Syria wouldn't be going on if we would reverse our policy on that. And it's war that has affected people's agricultural lands. So war and water are two things that cause climate refugees. Plus, the way we deal with climate refugees is we have a violent way of dealing with climate refugees. We have a jingoistic, racist way of dealing with climate refugees. Instead of letting people cross borders and welcoming people and admitting that we're probably a big part of the reason why they have to cross borders, what we do is just all this jingoistic nonsense that's great for the military-industrial complex, but it's not good for people. And so and they mentioned here droughts. So let's talk about how to prevent droughts. Atmospheric carbon is not the only thing that causes droughts. I've heard it said that we don't have the ground is not bare because we have droughts. We have droughts because the ground is bare. We have too much agricultural land that is bare when it should have a cover crop on it. We do too much tilling. We do too much tilling because these agribusiness corporations run the show. And we, the taxpayers, are subsidizing the bad work of the agribusiness corporations and the bad agriculture that they do. They till, we should be tilling very little. They use chemical fertilizers, we should be using very little in the terms of chemical fertilizers. They rely heavily on pesticides. We should be using very little pesticides so that we can create living soils. And when you have living soils, the water infiltrates or soaks into the soil. And that way you have, for one thing, what we have now is a process of desiccation. The continents are drier than they used to be because we design everything for drainage. We design our urban areas for drainage. It's like, get rid of that water. But when you get rid of the water, you're sending the flood downstream. What we could do is design our urban areas and our farms for hydration instead of drainage. Those are two polar opposites. We need to be letting and encouraging the water to soak into the ground so that it encourages vegetation. It encourages plant matter so that it cultivates, so to speak, cultivates the life underneath the ground. The life underneath the ground has been called the hidden half of nature. There's a whole biologically diverse ecosystem under the ground if we let it live. Instead, what we do is kill it with agribusiness technologies. So, there's a need for a holistic approach to climate that does not isolate atmospheric carbon as the only problem, because at best, atmospheric carbon is part of a much bigger picture. We are not going to solve the climate crisis unless we take a serious look at food, water, and war. We have to rethink everything. We have to, we have the opportunity to create a whole new world, but we have to rethink food, water, and war. We have to rethink democracy. We need to rethink our economy. So join me keep coming back, and we'll keep talking about these things. Thanks very much.